And maybe starting with Thomas, and of course we've seen slides, but maybe just go down the panel. Maybe just give us about a minute about who you are and what you do.
Yeah, so I'm part of Zebra Technologies. We are probably $3.7 billion in revenue. We provide solutions, hardware-enabled solutions in around identity and location and now condition of things and people. In the healthcare space, the hospitals are our primary customers. We also have a sports play, which really is not a healthcare space, but the NFL is a big customer of ours. And I run strategy in the IoT team. And we deliver solutions, Internet of Things, enable solutions to hospitals and other verticals.
Great. I'm Christine Lemke. I'm president of Evidation Health. We're on our way to $3.7 billion in revenue, but not quite there yet. We're a smaller company. We're a startup based in San Mateo, and we work with top global biopharma companies, top payers in the United States, and top providers to use a lot of the data that Alexander was talking about and match it to health outcomes so we could understand how interventions are actually impacting patients in the real world.
Janet, you good?
I'm Janet George, and I'm the Chief Data Scientist in Western Digital. I'm actually a practitioner, so I take massive amounts of data and do machine learning and AI with all of our wafer manufacturing data that's coming to us, and quite a bit of failure data.
John, anything you want to add to already your impressive?
No, I just, an observation that Janet and I were talking beforehand, and her failure data is very similar to our disease data. And the techniques that she's using for failure of silicon is almost identical to the techniques that we want to use for detecting breast cancer.
Yeah, I
and
would completely agree.
Fascinating
It was
for
fascinating
me that we found that out.
Oh, okay. Wow, that's well. There's some futurist somewhere that's going to make something out of that, I think, aren't they? Well, let's talk a little bit about. You're all from very sort of different aspects of the healthcare ecosystem. Maybe we'll start with Thomas on the end. Thomas, where do you see the value of healthcare data, and where do you see this as being? You know, we've had a lot of discussion in the last 2-3 weeks about pricing and outcome in this space, and policy driven from that or not from that, as the case may be.
Right.
You know, what do you see as being the value of this healthcare data being?
We primarily carry temporal data, which is the patient from first medical contact to end of treatment. And I would say, temporal data, the value is infinite because the value in time is the patient's life, essentially, or it can be used and leveraged for other treatments. So personally, I would say it's infinite, and it is unestablished. It is going to be a new frontier to create value for healthcare data.
Great. Maybe we just go down because it is kind of an interesting thing I'd like to see in the where you are in the ecosystem for yourself there. Christine, how would you feel about, what do you see the value of this healthcare data being?
So I always like to say that we don't see value in data, in fact, but we see value in feedback loops. So we specialize in a class of data in the healthcare system called behavior data. So this is data emitting from people's phones, from devices that Alexander was mentioning, some of the data exhaust I think he so eloquently put before. And if you can measure impacts of interventions through some of these signals, it reduces the patient burden overall. And it helps them visualize how treatments are actually affecting them and may influence them to do something different in real time. And so for us, it's like the data, of course, is a necessary ingredient for that feedback loop to occur, but we're kind of obsessed with making those feedback loops and connecting them.
Great. Alexander?
Yeah, to build on that, I would agree that closing the loop is absolutely critical. And for that, we need to combine not just the clinical data, but also the behavioral data, because I think that's a key component. And I don't know where I heard that, but somebody was saying, how the arc of history turns towards justice. So that's not me. But what I would say is the arc of healthcare draws towards outcomes. And I think regardless of what happens in the current administration, I think eventually more and more of healthcare will be reimbursed, and will be considered and thought of in terms of the outcomes that are achieved. And the only way that you know that you've achieved them is by measuring them and collecting the data. And just like you said, just the data isn't going to be enough. The whole point of the data is to then drive the outcomes, maybe drive future reimbursement, but also drive improvements in how you do this. Until people measured average length of stay, there was no way to improve it. Now we have that metric, and now we can improve that. And same thing, until we know how to improve mobility post-surgery, we can't really improve it. But now that we do, we should.
Very good. Jan?
So I actually agree with all of them, but I have something very interesting to share from the conversation that John and I were having as well. I was recently invited to this study, or to this little startup that was going to do AI on human emotion. And it practically, as I walked into the room, it took a picture of my face, and then it started doing a sentiment on my emotion. And it was really fascinating how quickly it was capturing my behavior and then coming up with outcomes, whether I was really stressed, and it would ask me things in voice. Janet, are you stressed today? Depending on the emotion on my face. And as I started poking around, I found out that it was a little bit of a shallow learning, because it was simply capturing my image and my face. And if I made a really bad face, it thought I was really upset, or if I was very stressed. So at first I said, this is shallow AI. But it was great because it was a starting point. And then as I started to think through, if it actually then asked me questions and started interacting with me, it could go deeper to know whether I was really stressed or I was acting stressed. And I think that cumulative effect of data, AI, machine learning is where the power is going to come from.
Wow. Yeah, very much. Yeah, not just healthcare, but a lot of other areas too. But yeah, definitely a very interesting set of outcomes potentially there.
Promises of machine learning is that in our standard models, which are not learning but are more regressive and using standard statistical approaches, you need a certain amount of data to have a predictive model. But after you collect that much data, the model doesn't really benefit by collecting more and more and more data. It generally just gets more noisy. But the promise of big data in this situation and kind of deep learning approaches is that you continuously get a bit better model as you collect thousands, hundreds, thousands, 1 million observations of what you're looking at. So like in that emotion, it would ultimately figure it out. A deep learning program would ultimately figure that out if it had enough examples. And I kind of feel like my take on your question was that you need deep integration. And for us, as far as our capacity of health, I think that includes your cognitive health, your physical health, your genetic profile, and your exposures throughout your life. And those four have to be integrated through time and your life course for us to be able to get a deep understanding of your health and even prognosis when you have disease.
Very, very interesting. I knew you guys were going to get along very well when I saw you guys chatting back there too. But just jumping off from your point, Janet, that you being confronted with that shallow AI system that is trying to, and perhaps not eliciting the right data responses from you to actually help you in that situation. I'm a person who grew up in a single-payer healthcare system before moving to the States, and our relationship with what information we give to our healthcare authorities is remarkably different than like just the reaction, doing this work in IoT around the healthcare vertical. Like, these are a lot of things we don't think about. How, obviously, because there are financial implications or other or treatment implications for you if you fear you're saying something that may or may not really be of issue. How, and maybe John, I'll start with you on this end on that, and anybody please feel free to jump in as well. How do you get patients comfortable with that, patients or customers, clients? How do you truly get them comfortable with that data collection experience?
Well, I think, and Alexander said that there's certain data that people hold close and other that they just give away freely. It's a lot of that's driven by our fear of harm being come by somebody learning something about us. And I would love it to see where that goes away, and it either has to go, I think it can only go away. There's no breaking silos, I think, through regulation, or saying that we don't need HIPAA. Or that the government will never use our personal information against us. The breaking it down really comes in that the individual becomes the ownership of the private key of their information. But if there was a public key that was opened up all that information for modeling and for prediction across the entire population, that's when things get interesting. And so I think there has to be a kind of a public-private key and personal ownership for that comfort.
And this gets talked about a lot in handling personal data in general, but certainly around this space. The idea of and I've heard it pushed so far to say it's your personal data portfolio or profile, call it whatever you like. And I've heard it pushed to the nth degree of saying, like, oh, well, that's monetizable, because you're like, okay, well, maybe it is, I don't know. But I'm not really thinking that's where I'm going to, I don't really want to run around thinking how I'm going to monetize my personal data. Alexander and I talked a little bit about, the role of, say, building a community around that. Is there that the stuff you want to share and don't want to share, especially for you guys, maybe Christine and Thomas are in the end, is there anything else that we should think about in terms of, or we have a group of startups out there who are doing something similar as well, and what they should be thinking about in terms of how people get comfortable with that?
Go ahead, Christine.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oops.
I mean, we probably should step back a little bit. I don't know how many people here are familiar with HeLa cells, by any chance? Yeah. So this happened in the 1950s, which was a young lady called Henrietta Lacks. She had cervical cancer. Her cells were harvested without her permission. And there's enough cells to go around the equator 10 times now. And a lot of cures that all of us, the polio vaccine, the AIDS cocktail, etc., were developed on her cells. So I think that precedent does not allow us to trust the system, essentially. So I think that we have to step back, and probably the Europeans will start doing this with the new law coming next year on privacy. So permission, privacy, security, micro contracts, monetization, all that has to come in to build a trustable system. I mean, HIPAA certainly can be extended. HIPAA is a very successful practice, I would say, but it certainly can be extended. The governance around HIPAA, there is compliance because there's enforcement. I think that's a good model to extend.
That's really, actually, I wasn't really aware of that. I don't want to put you on the spot because I don't think you're a lawyer, but what is can you maybe talk a little bit about what's
I'm not a
between
lawyer,
European?
but yes, but we have to
You're
be
going to play one
compliant.
tonight.
We have to be compliant next year. So there's next May, I think it's called GDRP, European General Data Regulation Protection Policy, or whatever it is. And health is, a very important part of it. The individual has control over the data. You have the right to be forgotten at any given time. You have the right to own your data. So it affects, not just healthcare companies. It affects Google, Facebook, etc. Everyone.
Right.
Yeah, but that's, it takes time for policy to catch up with technology. But I think that's the first step. It's going to be a decade of change from next year, where ownership of data will become more private and personal.
This is like a week-long conference of talk about data ownership, honestly. Like, this topic alone would blow out this panel. So I want to be careful about data ownership as a moniker. Like, I know we all use it. We own our home. We have a deed. We can transfer that deed to somebody else. The moment I give Alexander my data, it's gone. Like, I cannot retrieve it. I cannot stop Alexander from, giving it to somebody else, et cetera. The moment I give Tom my data, it's gone. And so there's no actual true ownership of data in this paradigm. And so really the thing that I think regulators, it's fun to say data ownership, but at the end of the day, like, I think regulators need to get serious about the use of data. And GINA is an example of where we've regulated the use of genetic information in order to not discriminate people against people who have genetic predispositions to diseases for insurance purposes or for employment purposes. Now, for some reason, they've excluded life insurance, but I think it's done in Europe. In some parts of Europe, they exclude life insurance from that too. But those are the types of things I think we need to get serious about, because I can tell you, as someone who's spent a very long career in data, if I know just like a little bit about your location data, and maybe I go to Axiom and maybe I have your cookie and I buy a little bit more marketing data about you, and then I go to a FICO thing and I get like a FICO score because you filled out some dumb survey online that gave me your FICO score, I can pretty much piece together your health profile. And so we're getting to the point where it's like we need to regulate the use of this data and create frameworks for it versus the fact that we might own our data or might control it in some way. I think control is probably gone right now. Your data is written in ink in lots of databases all over the world. And so if you're a startup, move fast, don't break trust. Move fast, don't break trust. Permission the data out. Obfuscate it as much as possible. Don't put out PII if you don't have to, but always like make sure people know what you're doing with that data. And then secondly, from a government perspective, get serious about data use. We should all be banging on this drum.
Yeah, actually, I want to build on that point about trust. It feels to me that HIPAA, for all its challenges that it poses as you want to do something with data, is essentially a contract between the population and the healthcare establishment. And the problem that I see with HIPAA is that the population doesn't actually see their benefit at all. All they do is they go to a physician, they have to fill out that form that means nothing to them. And then after that, magic happens, but there's no reward for them in any way. What am I getting out of this? What anybody getting out of both the protection, but also just anything that's going on there. And I think that's an area that is that we need to work on. There's another area that is maybe equally sensitive, and that's information or data about your financial status, right? So I'm not talking about the FICO score, I'm talking actually just about what you have in your investment accounts, what is your salary. I bet you that people share less about their salary than they share about most of their health. So, but there seems to be an understanding, and you call it really, really very, very close. And I think financially, a HIPAA, I guess nobody even trusts it, and maybe it's not even necessary. But I think for us as the healthcare system to get more out of data, we need to make sure that the consumers out there better understand what is in it for them.
I'm a data scientist, so I love data. But I'm of the opinion that you do have a right to your data. Privacy is important. You are giving that data to your healthcare professionals, and you expect that data to be used safely, not to bring harm, and volunteer for what data should be out there that's open and what data you won't give, just like you would in your DMV records say that, my organs can be donated or my organs should not be donated. You have a right to say that. And we will continue to have rights to say, I made 6 visits to the doctor. I don't want that information to be public, right? Versus I do want access to a certain study, or I do want access, or I am going to give my data to be part of a larger study. I think PII is very, very good, that it takes away personally identifiable information so we can do studies in aggregates in very large quantities that would actually provide insight and knowledge back to you. So I want the knowledge and I want the power that comes with the data, but I also want my particular specific data to be safe. And I think all consumers want their data to be safe and want permissions around the data. Just because the data is out there, it's always been out there. It's been in databases ever since data was around, right? But it doesn't mean you can aggregate that data. without your permission, because aggregation gives a whole different perspective to that data. So your data could be in different databases. And just like your financial data that's private, some of your health data is also private, maybe not all of it, and that is permission-based.
But there has to be a solution to safety and aggregation, because if you don't aggregate for health reasons, you always limit your ability to understand the full picture.
Yes.
If you aggregate for marketing or something else, where you're trying to aggregate kind of on the side without the consumer's knowledge, yeah, that's one thing. But there must be a way that we can, within a privacy framework, be able to intentionally aggregate as much as we can, as often as we can throughout the entire life course, or we just won't be able to solve, especially problems that are low incidence. Like even breast cancer, it's only 5 out of 1,000 women that go in for a mammogram that even have, that come up with a cancer. So when we do studies, my study in breast cancer has 500,000 women in it. And I only get 5 cancers out of every 1,000 a year of events that happen, and all those women were recruited. So I don't know anything else about them except the questions they filled out on a questionnaire. So if you had the ability to aggregate, you could learn more and get deeper into the understanding.
Yeah.
Do you think this is a technology problem or
No.
a regulation problem?
I think it's a regulation problem. I think HIPAA is absolutely necessary.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you very much for the panel for this. Thank you all of you as well for coming out tonight.